One of the oldest creatures in the franchise, and one of the most iconic. A creature we have seen featured all the way back in the original Fallout. Creatures that have been both allies and enemies, have showed us the path forward in our journeys, and have also been obstacles on said path. Some of the most memorable characters, and the most frightening of enemies. I speak, of course, of the Ghoul, the living dead, in all but name of the Fallout universe. Much is known of these individuals, and, when they become too far gone, of these creatures. But there's still much left to the realm of speculation and theory, such as their link to the possible supernatural present in Fallout, a topic we have looked into several times in the past, and one we shall hopefully explore in further detail in the future. One topic, however, that we haven't looked into is the process by which ghouls go feral, or, more accurately, the process by which they go from the ultimate examples of those in need of moisturizer to absolute shits. It's a strange process, one which we have never actually been a witness to, though we have been on the brutal receiving end of the results. The process renders ghouls into violent savages. Ghouls who, while horribly disfigured, and in possession of some kind of immortality or at least increased longevity, are about as amicable as anyone you find in the wastes, perhaps more so in some cases, as their experience of discrimination and years of life seems to have left some of them a little more tolerant to others, though this is not the case for all that we meet. Now before we continue, I want to take this chance to clear up a very common misconception. Ghouls are not the result of an FEV mutation, despite certain parts of the game suggesting just this. I base this primarily off of both the consensus of the community and the overwhelming amount of evidence that point to the causes being that of radiation. There are several I could point to, but I think two of the best examples are from two of the more interesting ghoul characters, Desmond Lockhart and Eddie Winters. Now I know what you're thinking. Is this a video on the feral process, or on ghouls, or what? It is the former, but I need to talk a bit about the latter first to make my later points. Now, on to these two buck agents. Desmond, as you all know, was a ghoul we met in Point Lookout. A hard bastard, even by our standards. He was one of the primary characters in the DLC, and, as far as I'm concerned, along with Calvert, the most interesting characters in the whole DLC. Now Desmond was part of something called The Great Game, which seemed to be a large-scale game played among billionaires and geniuses, just because. It seems to have involved both manipulating the world economy and politics, both to gain power and remove rivals. Now, with the impending war that, may or may not have been caused by them, many of them decided that they wanted to survive. Strange, right? And continue playing their little game. In Desmond's case, he chose radiation therapy to prolong his life, to turn him into a ghoul, and to allow him to survive in the shit show that is the post-war world. The second individual, Eddie Winters, has a story that, while not as intriguing as Desmond's, is still interesting, although is for another time. What we shall look at is one of his holodiscs, to Claire.
Claire, it's me, Eddie. It's been too long, I know. But I'm okay. We're okay. I know it's weird me disappearing just when the heat died down, but there's a reason. What we talked about? It's happening. Soon. Bombs, missiles, I don't know what. But the end is coming. I can't even tell you how much I paid my cloak and dagger friend for this info. So I guess me building that shelter was a smart idea after all, huh? But look, baby. There is one more thing. The reason I haven't been around for a while. You know those idiot brothers at Wicked Shipping? The ones smuggling the radioactive material? I put the screws to them. Got some of the stuff. I've been working with this doctor in East Boston. Guy's a fucking genius. Listen, I know it sounds crazy, but he had this theory. The right kind of radiation exposure at the right amounts, it can change human cells. Mutate them. Baby, I can live forever. Yeah, I know, it could kill me. I'm willing to chance it, but I can't risk losing you. So I'm the guinea pig. And I've been getting treatments. But don't worry, I'm fine. More than fine. I feel great. Amazing even. I think this crazy shit's really working. Eventually, this war will blow over. And when it does, I'm gonna walk out into Boston and pick up where I left off. I'm gonna own the future. I'm assuming you'll be dead by then, of course. But let's not dwell on the negative. So look, you come to the sub shop tomorrow night. You and I will go into the shelter together. Seal it up and wait for the big kaboom. Just, you might want to prepare yourself a little. Mentally and such, I look a little different now. But love is only skin deep, right?
Now, first off, love is only skin deep? Right. Behave yourself there, Eddie. There's a limit to sappy bullshit like that. But what is interesting here is, like Desmond, Eddie managed to get in touch with someone who, through the use of highly concentrated doses of radiation, believed, or knew, they can transform an individual into a ghoul. Though I wonder if this was the same scientist that Desmond got in contact with, or someone else. I mean, it's not completely improbable that multiple scientists would arrive at the same conclusion, if a bit unlikely. So these are two first-hand accounts of how two individuals, willingly and knowingly, underwent a process that was believed to actually induce ghoulification, and was seemingly a success. Another possible example, although not as in-depth, is that of Hancock of Fallout 4. He claims that his current condition of ghoulification was a result of going on a tour and injecting himself with an experimental radiation drug. Now, whether or not this is the whole truth, or whether it was more involved, that makes two people in the Commonwealth that underwent some sort of process to become ghouls. I would also like to take the chance to point out that their stories, as well as that of the Great Game, are something that I intend to explore in the future. So now we have adequate proof that the ghoulification process is caused, at least partially, by radiation, although clearly less clinical means can also have the same result, given the hundreds of non-ferals roaming around that, as far as we know, are not part of a grand conspiracy of immortals. Oh fuck. Anyway, given that large doses of radiation seem to achieve the same effect, then the dropping of the bombs would have provided an adequate amount of radiation. Though in that case, the less clinical, and indeed likely larger doses, may have played a part in turning some people feral almost instantly. So if this causes ghoulification, then what exactly contributes to going feral? What goes wrong in the minds, whether psychological or neurological, to cause the affliction? Well, some cut terminal entries from a ghoul doctor, Barrows, from Fallout 3, might just shed some light on this conundrum. The brain structure of a feral necrotic posthuman indicates that the regenerative ability of the neurological system that affords typical necrotic posthumans their longevity does not extend into the higher reasoning functions of the brain itself. This is a condition that I refer to as Ferocious Post-Necrotic Dystrophy. As the reasoning and high-order thinking portions of the brain deteriorate, the posthuman subject becomes increasingly hostile, giving into a carnal need to feed, as opposed to the capacity for thinking and reasoning that a typical necrotic posthuman retains. It remains unclear exactly what precipitates this change in biology and psychology, but anecdotal evidence seems to indicate that non-social ghouls, or those in isolation, are more prone to the condition. So now, we have an actual name for this condition: Ferocious Post-Necrotic Dystrophy. Dystrophy, or dystrophy, I'm not picky, is a disorder whereby an organ wastes away, in this case the brain. So according to Barrows, whatever actually gives the ghouls their longevity doesn't seem to, in the case of those who've gone feral, preserve higher order brain functions. The longevity in question, at least in Barrows' opinion, stems from mutation of the regenerative functions of certain transmitters in the spinal cord, so that adequate oxygen is delivered to sustain life, although not enough to stop necrosis. So, functions that differentiate a person from a savage animal are not preserved indefinitely. Their brain continues to waste away, or at least portions of it do, while their bodies continue on. Though at that point it could be argued that they are no longer the vessel for anything that could be described as a human consciousness. Another interesting point to note from Barrows' logs is that he notes that, while anecdotal, isolated ghouls do seem to be more susceptible to the process of feralization. This could explain why, for some of the ghouls we encounter, which have had some measure of shelter from the fallout, have still gone feral. This is generally quite common in certain vaults and lock facilities. They may not have started off this way, but due to isolation, they went feral in time. Wayne Gorski, in Gorski's Cabin, is an excellent example of this, as he was a survivalist with access to a bunker. but despite all of that, seems to have gone feral after some period of time, though we do not know how long. This isolation requirement doesn't appear to be all there is to it, though, as Zao has been alone, save for his feral ghoul shipmates, submarine mates? Fuck it. Yet despite this isolation, and constant exposure to radiation, not just the sudden exposure during the Great War, he hasn't gone feral. His mind is still as sharp as the sword he wields. Does this then suggest that some psychological component plays a part in feralization? Perhaps Zao saved it off simply out of a sense of duty, out of sheer force of will. Evidence of this possibly being the case emerges all the way in Nuka World, from a holodisc from Rachel Watkins, a pre-war organic chemist turned ghoul.
I think this is it. I can't go any further. I can feel it taking me. No, gotta keep it together a little longer. Oswald, I'm sorry. I've looked everywhere I could think, but there's no cure. What towns and outposts I could find said that we ghouls just go feral eventually, and there's nothing to be done. Maybe it was the misters. Held out. As long as I can. I know this isn't what you'd want, but I can't stand the thought of mindlessly attacking everyone around me. So I've decided to end it on my own terms. I don't know why it hasn't affected you the same, but if you still held it together, I want you to move on. Leave Nuka World. You can still make a life out there. It's not all as bad as we thought. I love you, Oz.
Now, this is one of the few times we hear of someone describing their own process of feralization, except once again we haven't actually witnessed it. We hear her begin to growl and moan, as if she is beginning to lose her sense of self and her self-control. However, this isn't what I find interesting. She says that everywhere she goes, everyone tells her that all ghouls go feral in the end, and that there is no cure, which was her goal in the first place. She talks about it not affecting him the same way as her, him being Oz, and I think the reason may be the psychological component coming into play here. Everyone tells her it's hopeless, so she begins to lose hope. She begins to despair. That, combined with her relative isolation in her travels, apart from the odd town, seems to have pushed her over the edge, causing her to take her own life, as opposed to taking another's when her grip on her sanity finally snapped. It should be noted that all the ghouls in Kitty Kingdom weren't feral to begin with. So we have an isolated captain, constantly exposed to radiation, who never changed, and a scientist who eventually did, or at least seems to have been in the process of changing. One had a duty, the other was losing hope. So perhaps the psychological factor plays into the longevity of their higher order functions, which possibly offers an explanation of why some isolated ghouls eventually go feral. Because their minds begin to go, because they lose hope. It's interesting to note that Oswald, like Zao, was also relatively isolated, and in his case was a full-on glowing one, being far more irradiated. Yet his determination to protect his home seems to have kept him from going feral, much in the way Zhao's sense of duty possibly did for him. However, some people seem to have gone feral extremely quickly, with Randall Clark, hardest of cunts, blessed be his name, reporting an encounter with something that seems to match the description of feral ghouls, and that was just over 30 years after the bombs hit. If this is in fact the lower bound for feralization, then it could be possible that it takes a few decades for the higher order functions to begin to deteriorate to the extent when they start trying to attack the filthy smoothskins, as ferals don't seem to go out of their way to attack ordinary ghouls. However, feral ghouls in certain areas, such as with Camp Searchlight and Fallout New Vegas, seem to have gone feral almost instantly. The larger doses of radiation are likely the cause, and there are surely many similar cases. However, for these cases, I think it's fair to treat them as a separate question than the feralization process, as we're primarily interested in how a ghoul turns feral, as opposed to ghouls that were likely feral from the very beginning. So if some turn sooner than others, then what is it that allows some to survive longer? Is it something to do with the dosage or concentration of the radiation they were exposed to? Is it down to will? Is it random? Well, there is one very unique ghoul that seems to suggest that while some or all of the above may play somewhat of a role, there may be one more factor. One that may be the X factor that is referenced in Barrows' other cut terminal entry. That ghoul is Billy Peabody, and that factor is genes. Billy Peabody is a ghoul that, frankly, deserves a video all to himself. I mean, I am in awe of this lad, as he manages to almost completely fuck the canon for ghouls all on his own. Setting aside the fact that he's the only child feral ghoul we ever meet, and seems to indicate that the aging process is in fact halted completely, setting aside the fact that despite literally being inside a refrigerator and being completely isolated from all contact for 210 fucking years, he didn't go feral. Setting aside the fact that he doesn't seem to require food, which has always been a somewhat controversial point of the canon. And finally, setting aside the fact that despite almost complete darkness for 2 centuries, his eyes still fucking work. Why isn't he blind? Setting all that aside, what is interesting is that Billy didn't become a feral ghoul, and neither did his mother Carol or his father Matt. Yes, they all stayed sane all these years. Now, it could be that as a child, Billy is more resistant to the despair that takes many ghouls. His parents had each other, so they weren't isolated. But that still doesn't explain why none of them went feral just due to deterioration, like so many, regardless of whether or not they were isolated. Well, a possible explanation comes from the dialogue of Matt and Carol. Genes. They tell Billy that it must be something in their genes that allowed him to survive like them. Now, while this is by no means conclusive evidence, it would actually explain a lot of gaps in most existing theories. I mean, other people have been together and gone feral, while some, exposed to the same amount of radiation, remain sane for centuries. So perhaps something in the genetic code of certain individuals allows them to stave off feralization, even if factors such as isolation are affecting them. It could be due to some resistance to neurological disease or neurological deterioration present in their genes, which allows their higher order functions to remain. So to put all of what we know in order, the ghoulification process is one induced by radiation, halting the aging or deterioration, besides the horrific damage to their bodies, or at least slowing it, in all individuals involved. It is caused by both accidental exposure and intentional, as a way to achieve immortality. However, all ghouls are at risk of, or at least many believe they are at risk of, Ferocious Post-Necrotic Dystrophy, or Feralization, which erodes higher order brain functions and reasoning, leaving a savage beast behind. Time seems to play some part in this, as after a few decades, and possibly sooner, ghouls turn feral, either due to continued exposure or deterioration over time. The rate of this deterioration seems to vary from individual to individual, with psychological factors, such as the effect of isolation, possibly acting as accelerants to the process. Though even this varies, as some have lasted for centuries before turning feral. Whether or not they succumb could be influenced by the strength of the will of the individual in question, with a goal or a strong sense of purpose staving it off, possibly indefinitely. However, for others who survive in spite of these circumstances, and show no deterioration at all, their genes could play a factor, with some people being better adapted to coping with radiation, and possibly dystrophy, whether to radiation or psychological effects. Radiation buildup over time may also play a role in continued deterioration, as continued buildup gives glowing ones their luminescence. A glowing one's ability to cope with radiation buildup may be a byproduct of their genes, and may play a role in resistance to turning feral. This may explain why non-feral glowing ones are so rare, as a ghoul would need to undergo adequate amounts of continued exposure to become a glowing one, as well as possess the genes to starve off feralization, and possibly also have a strong enough will, if both are required to some extent. Glowing ones like Jason are an example of this, as he was a strong-willed ghoul with a clear purpose, a purpose that may have kept him sane, much like Zao. One last point of interest is whether the artificial process of ghoulification, underwent by Eddie Winters, Desmond Lockheart, and to a certain extent, Hancock is dependent on genetics, if genetics really does play a role in staving off fertilization. It could be that, given proper time and equipment, the process could be refined in such a way as to avoid the pitfalls of the transformation induced by regular exposure. Perhaps this way would allow someone without the appropriate X factor to still achieve a stable ghoulification. Or perhaps all ghouls do indeed go feral eventually, and will and luck has staved it off so far, which means that they're all ticking time bombs, suffering an affliction that, as far as we know, has no cure. Hi folks. First off, it's an understatement to say that it's been a while, and I won't go into too much detail here about where I've been. Either I've already made a video or one will soon be out. Either way, I have been very busy, and I've been going through some personal issues, which I will try, or already have, explain. The second, the Great Game, Desmond, Lockheart, and others that I have mentioned here are all possible video topics. So if there is anything in particular that you would like to see, please either post a comment about it, or like a comment that already mentions it, so I will see it. I will also be moving on to different content, but as above, I have either already detailed or soon will detail that. As always, and perhaps more so now given my long absence, any support you can show is appreciated. And remember, due to weird YouTube shit that 2 years on still isn't fixed, click the bell icon and enable notifications, or in all likelihood YouTube will just decide what to show you, which will not likely be my videos, as YouTube knows what's best for you, apparently. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you will join me in the next one, and until then, goodbye.